Hey everybody, it's Booray, and today we're going to talk about dragging the shutter. What is it? How do you do it? And most importantly, when do you do it? Before we get started, don't forget to check out my page. Go to boorayperry.com/education. I'll put a link right down there in the description. And on that page, you'll find everything that I offer. Links to all of the gear that I use, both professionally and with my travel kit and my Fuji X100V. You'll also find free ebooks that I have to help you if you're just getting started in photography, including 20 definitions that you should know if you want to be a photographer, as well as what to do with your camera when you first set it up, when you first buy it. And you'll also find my ebook on natural light photography, which is the first step for anyone who really wants to get into photography. You need to learn how to see the light, how to find the light, how to work with the light, how to set up your camera. It's a 75-page ebook, and you will get a huge discount if you use the code that is down in the description. All right. Oh, don't forget to follow me on Instagram too, by the way. Follow me on Instagram and join my group on Facebook, Pro Photo Talk with Booray Perry. Man, this list gets longer every time I make a video. All right. Today we're going to talk about dragging the shutter. Dragging the shutter is one of those things that I talk to professional photographers who don't even know what dragging the shutter is, because it's the sort of thing that you don't necessarily need it a lot when you're a photographer, but if you need it, it can prove invaluable. And it's also one of those things that I just think is a really cool thing about photography, understanding how light works, how physics works, how your camera works, and this all leads to dragging the shutter. So, in order to talk about this, let's start by looking at some pictures and setting up a scenario that explains where and when you will need to drag the shutter. Here we go. So let's start with a simple image that has movement in it. So I got this little wind-up doll, I set it on the table, I set up my X100V, and I wound up the doll and I got it to jumping. Now I'm shooting this at ISO 1600 and shutter speed 125, 1/25 of a second, and f2, wide open on my Fuji X100V. And as you can see, at 125th of a second, I am definitely getting blur. I'm getting movement blur in the little toy here, right? So I'm going to have to go faster than 1/25th of a second in order to freeze this motion. But what happens if we go slower? All right, well, here it is at 1/30th of a second, and as you can see, the blur is even worse. Right, it's really, really bad blur, bad motion blur here now at 1/30th of a second. So what happens if we turn the flash on? Well, we still got blur, it's just now it's bright blur. Now we can really see this doll, this little toy well, but we can also see that there is just a ton of motion blur. Now I'm at 1/30th of a second here. And let's go to the next picture, also using flash. What happened? I'm still at 1/30th of a second, and yet all my motion blur has disappeared. And my moving toy is frozen and perfectly clear with no motion blur whatsoever. What changed? Well, it's pretty obvious what changed, right? Let's go back one picture. We went from here to here. So obviously the background, the ambient light, got a whole lot darker. And that's because I changed my camera setup. Here I was at ISO 500, and here I was at ISO 160. Here I was at f2, and here I was at f4. So I purposely set up my camera to make the surrounding ambient light very, very dark. And when I did that, suddenly the motion was frozen, even though my shutter speed didn't change. This is dragging the shutter. This is what we're talking about when someone says, I had to drag the shutter in order to get that picture. So what does that mean exactly, dragging the shutter? Here's the thing you have to remember. The reason that your camera is recording the motion as being blurry is because the shutter speed is open. The shutter is open for so long. The shutter speed is so slow, 1/30th of a second, for example. The shutter speed is so slow and the shutter is open for so long that while the shutter is open, the subject is moving before it closes. So if you want to take a picture of something that's running, you want to go take a picture at a track meet, right? You have to have a really fast shutter speed so that that shutter opens and closes before the person can move. Even though they're running, it opens and closes so fast that it freezes them in place. And as your shutter speed gets slower, depending on the speed of the thing you're taking a picture of, eventually you reach a point where the person or the object moves while the shutter is still open. And when that happens, it records that movement and you get blur in your picture. So the trick is to fix it so that the camera cannot see the subject move. And the way you do that is by lowering the ambient light. Now here's the tricky part, and the part that I think is so cool. Think about your flash on your camera. Your flash turns itself on and then it turns itself off. And it does this literally at the speed of light, which is, my understanding is pretty fast, right? So if the camera can only see your subject when the flash is on them, and the flash is on them at the speed of light, and then it turns off, that is the fastest shutter speed you could ever hope for. Your camera can never have a shutter speed that's as fast as the speed of light. So if the area that your subject is in is dark and your camera can't see your subject unless the flash is on them, then you effectively have a shutter speed that is the speed of light. It's going to flash on them at the speed of light. Your camera's going to see that, and then the light's going to turn off and it's not going to see them anymore. And they could still be moving. You could still have a slow shutter speed. Your shutter speed could be a 30th of a second or a 15th of a second. And they could be moving, but your camera can't see them because it's dark. It only saw them during that one burst of light at the speed of light. And you freeze them in place with that. A great example is, you remember when you were a kid maybe and you went to like a dance in the 8th grade and somebody had a strobe light? And the strobe light goes off, and when you see people dancing in a strobe light, they're always like jerking around and roboting. It's because your eyes can't see them unless the strobe light hits them. And every time that light goes off, you can't see them. And when it comes back on again, they're in a new place. And it goes off, and then they're in a new place. And so it makes them look like they're jerking around. It's the same exact thing that happens with your flash. And dragging the shutter is a great way to be able to shoot at a low shutter speed and still capture movement. So now we know what it is, we know how to do it. Basically, you've got to lower your camera settings so that your subject is dark when you look at them. When you look at them through the camera, they need to be dark. If they are, then it doesn't matter if they're moving. Your flash will freeze them. That's dragging the shutter. The big question is, why do you need to do this? When do you ever need to drag the shutter? And the truth is, there's a lot of times that you won't ever need to drag the shutter. But people like me, people who shoot weddings and events, we drag the shutter all the time. And here's why. So here's a couple, right? Outside their hotel. They've just gotten married. And when I'm setting up this picture, my priority is I want my couple to be lit, of course, but I also want that palm tree to show up in the picture. And I want to be able to see the building behind the palm tree. So if I let my camera knock down the light too much, then the building's going to go completely black. And I'm going to have this palm tree in this giant black sky. I don't want that. I want depth to my picture. So I've got to expose for the palm tree and then light my people with a flash. So in this camera, in this picture, my ISO is at 3200, which is as high as I would shoot with an ISO. This picture's from several years ago. And my f-stop is 3.5, and I'm using a full frame camera here. So 3.5 is about as wide open as I wanted to go with a picture like this because they're moving. So I need a depth of field that's going to, account for a little bit of movement on their part or a little bit of slowness in getting the focus. So I want to be at f3.5. ISO is at 3200, which is as sensitive as I want my sensor to be. In order to get that palm tree to look the way I want it to look, I've got to go down to a 30th of a second. Now this would be a problem if my couple were lit by natural light, like the palm tree is. But they're not. They're in a dark spot. There's hardly any light on them where they are. So I can put a flash on them. The flash will freeze them in place, while the slow shutter speed will capture all the light in the ambient and give me a complete scene. If I shot this at a fast shutter speed, it would be two people with a giant black field behind them. And this is where dragging the shutter comes in handy. Places like sunsets, places like buildings in the background at night that you want to show up. You can drag the shutter and get those buildings and those things and that sunset to show up while using your flash to light your subject, even if your flash is moving. And the place that I do this the most is at parties. When I am working at a party, I don't want my images to look like all these people are in a cave. I don't want to just be a black room with the light on the two people. So I drag the shutter all the time. I'm at a 40th of a second here, and these people are dancing. If this room was fully lit, if they were fully lit, and I shot at 40th of a second, they would be blurry. But they're not, because the dance floor is pretty dark. The light in this room is off the dance floor. If you look back here, you'll see uplights and these lights back here. This is where most of the ambient light is. And this light is not touching them. They're in a very dark area on the dance floor. So I can drag my shutter down to a 40th of a second, freeze them with my flash, and because I'm at 40th of a second, I'm able to pick up the light in the back of the room and show you some depth and show you the room, which is a look that I personally like. There are photographers who don't. I'm sure there are photographers who don't do this, and they shoot, and all their dance floor pictures are just people in a black, dark cave, and that's perfectly fine. Everybody gets to decide for themselves what they want to do. But personally, my style, and one of the things that I'm proud of, is that when you hire me to do your wedding or your bar mitzvah, I'm able to make the room look more lit, so that you can see this room that you paid all this money for in order to have this party. So there it is. That's dragging the shutter. It's not that hard once you get the hang of it. It can be a little daunting at first because, well, there's physics involved, but I can tell you that here's the easiest way to set it up. If you have a situation where you need to expose for the background, try and expose for the background, if you can, while having a shutter speed that is fast enough to freeze movement. And this is if you've got people who are moving. If they're not moving, it's not going to be that big of a problem. But if they're going to be moving, like walking, like my couple were, then you want to set up your camera so that you expose for the background and the background looks good, and then use the flash to light your couple. But if you can't get that background exposed and a shutter speed fast enough to freeze the movement, then you're going to have to lower your shutter speed. And as you do that, you might have to test it. You might have to take a picture. Oh, okay, that one's okay, but can I lower my shutter speed a little more? Can I lower my shutter speed until you find the number? And I do this at parties all the time. Once the dancing starts and the lights are down low and the people are dancing, I'll take a picture at like, a 100th of a second, and then I'll just go lower and lower and lower with my shutter speed. Every time I do, my background gets brighter until I finally reach the point where the background light is so bright that my camera can now see those people moving even without the flash. And when that happens, blur. And when I reach that point, I go, okay, that's too slow with my shutter speed. That was a 15th of a second, and that's too slow. Let's go back to a 30th of a second and try it again. And then I'll look at my camera, I'll take a close look. Are they blurred? No. Now I know. I can shoot at 1/30th of a second. I can shoot with these settings, and I will be able to freeze the motion with my flash while getting the rest of my room nice and bright. It's a great trick. It is used primarily by people like me, people who work weddings and events and parties, and people who take pictures at night outdoors, and they light people and they want the background to be bright. That's when we use dragging the shutter. And you can use it with any flash. If you've got a little built-in flash on your camera, if you've got a big flash on top, if you've got an off-camera flash, it doesn't matter. What matters is that if the flash isn't firing, your subjects need to be dark to the camera. If that's the case, the flash will freeze them, and I mean they can be moving, and it'll still freeze them. All right, don't forget to join all my stuff, join my group, and check out my page, boorayperry.com/education, and I hope you liked the video. I'll be back soon.